Okay, today's book is The Courts of Chaos by Roger Zelazny, Book 5 in the Chronicles of Amber series. So this is the 5th book and the final book in the Corwin cycle, and the final book in this volume I have. This Fantasy Masterworks series collects the first 5 books of the Chronicles of Amber into one volume. There is, I am told, via Wikipedia and other sources on the internet, a follow-up series in the Chronicles of Amber called the Merlin cycle. But my book ends here at the Courts of Chaos, which is the end of the Corwin cycle. This book was originally published in 1978, but the version I have here is collected as part of this Fantasy Masterworks edition. We are now, obviously, well into the series at this point. This is the final part of the first cycle, and I am just going to jump right into it and talk about plot-specific details and spoil stuff. And I'm also not going to make much attempt to catch anyone up who's not familiar with the series. In other words, the target audience of this review is people who are already familiar with this book, or people who have read the book already. If you haven't read the book, you want to start off with 9 Princes in Amber and enjoy. You should, you'll have fun with this series, but don't watch this video yet. So, the Courts of Chaos. At the end of the last book, we saw that the King Father Oberon was revealed to have been Ganelon. But either way, the King Father is now part of the action again. It's an interesting question how long in advance Roger Zelazny was plotting all these plot twists. I guess if you assume he was plotting everything from the beginning, then Oberon, in the guise of Ganelon, has been part of the series since the 2nd book, The Guns of Avalon. But I don't know, I need to reread this book, but I think back to what I remember of Ganelon from The Guns of Avalon, and I don't know. My memories are that Ganelon in that book was a lot more naive. Definitely by the 4th book there's a lot of foreshadowing going on that Ganelon is Oberon. But does that foreshadowing extend all the way back to the 2nd book? I don't remember. But either way, this is the first time that Oberon is part of the book, part of the action as Oberon. Now, the Oberon plot thread is something that, to give credit where credit is due, is very clever about this series. We hear the name Oberon way back in book 1. And where exactly the King Father has disappeared to, everybody assumes he's dead, but nobody knows how he dies, is one of the mysteries of the book, but it's one of so many mysteries that, at least for me, I didn't really latch onto it. Maybe people who are a little bit more clever than me would have latched onto that and said, okay, this is going to be a major plot point over this next 5 books. What happened to Oberon? But it didn't really click for me in the first book. But then gradually, as you keep reading, it becomes a bigger and bigger plot thread. What exactly happened to Oberon? Where is he? And then finally he's revealed, and now in the 5th book we get a glimpse of him, except the very beginning of the 5th book starts off and Oberon is away from the action again, and characters are just recounting what he said, what he had previously told them off screen, so to speak, not on the pages. And even in this 5th book, Oberon remains a very elusive presence. We do get some dialogue with him and Corwin, but not a lot. He is acting as a general. He's setting everything up. There's a weird scene where sorry, changing topics now. Very beginning, Random and Corwin are talking, and Random says that Oberon had left him with some sort of directive to keep an eye out on Martin, but hadn't said exactly what that meant, and he had chuckled when he said that. And then there's some sort of commotion where they run down, and Martin and Dara and Benedict are in the throne room, and there's some sort of invisible force field that they can't get to them. And Corwin is reminded about how this was all very similar to the vision that he had when he was up in the amber and the clouds, the name of which is Turna Nocht, which according to Wikipedia I think is the Welsh name for the land of the dead that's been appropriated in this series, which means I'm pronouncing it wrong, I'm sure. In this series, it refers to the shadow of, not the shadow, the reflection of amber up in the clouds. Shadow in this series has a specialized meaning. It means one of the multiverses, or one of the universes within the multiverse. They call a shadow. Anyways, he notices that it had paralleled that vision he had had when he was up in the amber in the sky. And then sure enough, a sword comes out, and Corwin recognizes that sword as his, and recognizes that there's some ghost figure there, which is analogous to him when he was perceived as a ghost when he was up in the amber and the clouds. So that's all very clever as far as it goes, but unless I miss something, exactly what is going on is never fully explained. And I get the sense that it's not meant to be. I mean, I don't know, maybe it gets cleared up in one of the books in the Merlin cycle. I don't know. But it's one of the loose ends that's still hanging around by the end of this book, even though this book is the last book in the series, is what was going on with Corwin's sword, and who was, I mean, we know who the ghost, sorry, I'm trying to think as I speak, but what was going on? Was there a ghost Corwin there? Who was that? What was he? The Corwin from Terek Nocht? It's just a little bit confusing. Then there's some talk with Dara, some talk with Oberon, and then Corwin gets sent on a journey to the Courts of Chaos. And I was double checking the plot of this on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia pointed out that to get from Amber to the Courts of Chaos means he has to travel all across the multiverse, through all the lands of shadow. So starting at one end, going through all the universes, finally ending up at the end in the Courts of Chaos. When I was reading this, I don't remember cluing into the fact that he was spanning the whole multiverse. I mean, certainly I knew that most of this book was involving a long journey through different parts of shadow, but I must have missed it in the prose, which I can sometimes do. With this series, I find that when I check the Wikipedia plot summary afterwards, I'll sometimes pick up some things that I missed when I was reading it. So it could well have been in there somewhere. But anyways, he's traveling the whole of the multiverse. I've made the comment before in my reviews of this series that I don't always enjoy the traveling through shadow sections, and particularly the weird prose that Roger Zelazny goes into whenever they're shifting through shadow. Shifting through shadow in the parlance of this book, meaning traveling across different universes. And it's been a consistent feature of all these books. Every time they travel through shadow, that kind of prose structure pops up. at this point, it's not really worth complaining about, because at this point it's clearly just a feature of the series. And if I don't like it by this point, that's on me. Certainly you know it's coming by this point in the series, by the 5th book. So I struggled through, again, some of that awkward prose. I don't know, the thing about those traveling through shadow sections is it's not just a strange paragraph here and there. It's 2, 3, sometimes 4 pages of really difficult to read prose. And much more than a page of this, I really find my mind wandering, and I really have to force myself to try and pay attention, or wonder how important all of these little details will be to the overall plot as I'm reading. But that complaint aside, there are some really bizarre and wonderful images that come through on this. Like he's traveling along, and he's passing shadows with like a green sun in them, and he looks out and there's a blood red sea, and he makes a comment that he can see ships fighting in the blood red sea, and the ships just have skeletons on them. So there's a bunch of skeletons fighting each other on ships in a blood red sea, and then there are sea serpents circling around the ships, like these sea dragons or whatever. And I don't know, it sounds really wonderful and fantastical, and you just read those scenes and you think, boy, I could, imagine a whole novel just set here exploring what's going on with these skeleton navies fighting each other, with the sea serpents dancing around them, swimming around them. And that's the appeal of these books, is those wonderful scenes and those wonderful sections. He gets a message from Oberon, the King Father. Oberon's mission in this book was to try and repair the pattern. And if the pattern could not be repaired, it means that the whole universe, or the whole multiverse, would be destroyed. He gets a message in the form of a bird that... The bird brings him what did they call it? The jewel of judgment was the name. That Oberon was to send to him, but he doesn't know if this jewel means that Oberon has succeeded in repairing the pattern, or if Oberon has failed. And if Oberon has failed, it means the multiverse is going to be destroyed. And then, as he's traveling, he notices that there's a storm kind of coming up behind him through the multiverse, whichever universe he goes to, the storm is still coming up behind him. And he thinks that maybe the storm is destroying the multiverse, and he's just barely one step ahead of it. For better or for worse, I got the impression that a lot of these rules about chaos and the pattern and Amber and the multiverse and all of this were arbitrary, or were being made up as Roger Zelazny goes along. And not that that's a bad thing necessarily. I guess, the whole point of a fantasy series is you have a universe which is completely created from the mind of the author and has all these rules that the author gets to create for their fantasy world. It's just that the rules always had a sense of being made up by someone. Instead of just... I didn't get the sense that these were like organically how the multiverse would function. I just got the sense that somebody is making up rules as they go along with the story. I mean, that being said, I think the rules are entirely consistent. I don't think there's continuity errors. I may have missed something. But you just get the sense that they're a little bit arbitrary. But anyways, the storm is following him. He goes into a cave to get some relief from the rain. And he meets another person there who's in this universe. And that other person asks his name, and he says Corwin. And he says, oh, right, there's the prophecy of the Archangel Corwin, who had come here just before the storm that was going to destroy the world. Are you him? And that was another really interesting, bizarre detail, that this universe far off in this land of shadow somehow had this prophecy about how Corwin was going to come through. And then Corwin discovers that his horse has been stolen. And he's able to track down the thieves just as they're disappearing into a cave in the mountain. And he's able to break open the door and follow them down. And there are I don't believe they ever say the word leprechaun, but they're leprechauns, essentially. They are, I think it's described as what? I saw, he says, something like, I saw something that would be straight out of an Irishman's dream. These little people dancing and fiddling and drinking. So that's essentially saying they're leprechauns without saying they're leprechauns. And they agreed to give him his horse back, but then they put some sort of spell on him and trick him into staying and drinking with them, and he's just getting very sleepy. But then he does finally snap out of it in time to save himself, and goes back, and then the leprechauns realize that he's the Archangel Corwin from the prophecy. And then he continues on, and I'm not exactly sure, but I think he's getting to the end of the multiverse. So there's no more shadow universes to shift through. But there is this very strange land that he's got to journey through, where there's a tree, and he cuts off a branch of the tree, and then the tree says, hey, what are you doing? I spent a long time growing that branch. He says, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you could talk. And then it turns out that the tree was planted there by his father Oberon, I think to mark to mark the distinction between the multiverse and the chaos, perhaps? And then he's joined by, oh, by the way, the tree's name is Yig, which Wikipedia reminded me that was a name very similar to the tree that connected the different universes in Norse mythology, which perhaps I should have remembered because last year I read Norse Myths by Neil Gaiman, but I did not make that connection on my own. I needed the help of Wikipedia. And then there's a bird of ill omen called Hugi, and again Wikipedia drew my attention to the fact that that was similar to one of Odin's ravens, which is something I should have remembered but didn't, who's following Corwin along and mocking him on his journey. And this bird has been here since the beginning of time, waiting for him to finally make it here. So again, another clue that this was all prophesied, another indication that this had all been prophesied before. And they encounter a number of really bizarre things in this wasteland. There's a giant in a bog. It takes Corwin a while to notice that it's a giant, but it's just this big head who's completely at eye level with them. And the reason that he's at eye level is then because it turns out the rest of him is submerged in the bog. And the giant asks for Corwin to acknowledge him, and Corwin now offers to help him get out of the bog. But the giant doesn't want to get out of the bog. He's just depressed because he's stuck in the bog, and he wants the whole world to end so that his depression can end. And Corwin says, well, why don't you just get out of the bog rather than waiting for the whole world to end? And the giant, I forget exactly what the giant says. Something like, oh, no, I'm just sick of it. I'd rather just end it all rather than go through the effort. And then Corwin gets into a little philosophical discussion with the bird Hugi afterwards about how that relates to the attitude some people have where they just assume give up on the universe rather than try and struggle or something like that. Sorry, so, I'm discovering as I talk through this book that some of the details are a little bit fuzzy in my memory. I don't know if that's I don't know. For whatever reason, that's how my memory works. And then they encounter. What else happens? There's a dark humor part where Corwin is being tormented by this bird who keeps mocking him so many times. And he's really hungry and famished because he's been traveling through the wasteland and he needs energy. And the bird is mocking him, saying, "You'll never do it. I'll see you eat crow first," which is presumably just a metaphor. But then Corwin reaches out and snaps the bird's head off and eats it. There's a passage that said, the way he phrased those words, it made it sound like a sacrifice, but I had been planning to do it anyways. Typical of the dark humor in this book, and maybe particularly the dark humor in this 5th book, I think is stronger than the previous books in this series. Eventually, he summons up the energy to make another pattern, which is something he can apparently do with the Jewel of Judgment. This is again where we get back into a lot of the rules here, just seeming to not... I mean, they make sense as far as they go, but they don't... They do seem a little bit arbitrary, like somebody's just sitting at the rule book saying, like, these are the rules of Amber. But yeah, those are the rules, apparently. If you have the Jewel of Judgment, you can make another pattern. And then, yeah, Brand, his antagonist, appears and takes the stone from him. He continues traveling. I think he meets the jackal, the devious jackal, tries to trick him into the cave. And then finally, he gets to the Land of Chaos where there's a big battle going on. And he meets the Duke Borel, who had been Dara's tutor in fencing. And the Duke Borel wants to have a duel with Corwin to see who is the best. And he says, he asks Corwin if he's wearing armor, and Corwin's not. So the Duke Borel takes off his armor because he says, "I don't want people saying that I took advantage of you when I killed you." In other words, he's got a very defined sense of chivalry. He won't kill anyone unless he can meet them on equal terms, which Corwin thinks is just ridiculous. And Corwin ends up tricking him, and there was some sort of maneuver here that was described, and I couldn't really visualize exactly what was going on in my head when it was described in the book, which typically happens to me with a lot of the fight scenes in the Chronicles of Amber. I'm not sure if that's my fault or the book's, where he gets some sort of a black cloak over, gets the cloak over Borel's head, so that Borel is struggling to take the cloak off, and then he just leaps in and stabs him in the chest, so is able to defeat him by a trick. And Borel says something like, "Oh, base, I expected better of thee." Like, he's more upset about the breaking of the chivalric rules than he is about the fact that he's just been killed, which again is typical of the dark humor within this book. Although we do get some sense at the very end of this book that there was some emotional impact to his death, because Dara, at the very end of the book, has found out about this and resents Corwin for having killed her teacher in such an underhanded way. But at the time of the actual death, it's just presented as a joke. And then there's a confrontation finally with Brand and Deidre up on the cliffs. Now, Deidre has been... well, she's one of the princesses of Amber, and she's been in this series since book 1. I think in the very beginning, in the 9 Princes in Amber book. She's mentioned as being Corwin's sister, but somebody he feels romantic affection for. If memory serves, it's mentioned, it's not made so explicit in the first book, but it's made explicit in subsequent books that he definitely feels a romantic or sexual attraction to her. but is holding off on acting on it because she's his sister. And she doesn't really do much else within the course of the series, unless I'm forgetting something. Except at the very end, Brand has got her with like a knife on her throat. And they're trying to negotiate with Brand, saying, okay, don't kill her. What are you hoping to accomplish here? You've got to give in or something. And then Cain shoots Brand with an arrow through the throat, and Brand falls off the cliff and grabs Deidre as he falls down with him. So presumably they're both killed from the fall, and this causes Corwin some anguish. Although I was really confused as I read this why I as a reader was supposed to really care about Deidre, because she had not been a major part of this series up until then. So making her death at the end into a big deal struck me as a bit strange. And then also, the whole thing about Corwin's romantic or sexual attraction to her struck me as, at the end, something which never really went anywhere in the series. I mean, what was the point of that, really? I could see it if they had consummated their love or something like that. And it would have been something that was pushing boundaries, obviously, because it would have been an incest plotline, and, you know, all the shock and scandal that goes with that. But, you know, to a certain extent, if you're going to bring something like this up, there's what's the expression? Shit or get off the can. You know, either do it or don't do it. But I would almost have preferred that Roger Zelazny went with the shocking incest storyline rather than just the nothingness that ended up from it. I've often wondered as I went through this series how much of it was plotted from the very beginning and how much of it was made up as he went along. It's a question I've been going back and forth on, because there definitely seem to be points for each column. But I wonder if this Deidre thing is a point in the column of some of this was definitely made up as he went along, and Deidre, he just didn't know what to do with her in the end. That being said, though, they were killed by Cain, and Cain was supposed to have been dead from book 3, but then it turned out that Cain was faking his death all along, and there have been a fair amount of those resurrection things throughout the book. I mean, I think Cain was the only one where we saw a dead body. But Martin, at the beginning of book 4, we definitely got the impression that he had been killed. Then it turned out he had been alive. Oberon, of course, the beginnings of this series, it was definitely introduced like he had been long dead. And then later we got hints that he was alive. Who else? There have been, I think, a few different characters in this series where it was heavily implied that they were dead, and then they weren't dead. And then Cain, of course, turns back and comes back at the end, and he had been faking his death all along, complete with a dead body double and everything. So when Brand and Deidre fall off the cliff, I was thinking, okay, they're not really dead. They're going to show up later. And then they didn't show up later, but we didn't ever recover their bodies, did we? So I'm thinking either they show up in the Merlin cycle, which I've not read yet, or I don't know. Whatever happens, I have a hard time believing they were really dead. Even if it turns out that they never show up later in this series, I'm still kind of assuming Zelazny was leaving the door open for that, whether or not he ended up acting on it. Speaking of which, this is the end of this book here, and I'm out in Vietnam now, so these used books I get are a matter of chance whether I stumble upon them or not. This one I was lucky enough to stumble upon at a used bookstore, but I'm not anticipating stumbling on the books in the Merlin cycle anytime soon, so I think this is the end of the series for me. unless some future day I might be back in the US or something and might track down the Merlin cycle at some point. Although everyone, not everyone, but many people seem to say that the Merlin cycle isn't nearly as good anyways.